Somewhere off the coast of Washington state, an Ohio-class submarine is on patrol right now, carrying enough firepower to reshape the 21st century. It's been at sea for weeks. It'll stay at sea for weeks more. And when it finally returns to port, something unusual happens. The sailors who brought it home get off, and a completely different crew, one that's been training and resting for months, walks aboard and takes it right back out. That's not a swap of a few key officers. It's not partial. The entire crew, top to bottom, gets replaced by a second, fully qualified crew that has never sailed a single day on that specific patrol. Every Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine in the fleet is assigned 2 complete crews for exactly this purpose, according to the Navy. They're called blue and gold. Why would the most expensive, most secretive vessels in the American arsenal need 2 entire sets of sailors each? It's not about fatigue for its own sake. It's a Cold War-era math problem the Navy never stopped solving. How do you keep a submarine that must never be found always at sea without wearing out the humans who run it? This video gets into how the 2-crew system actually works, why the Navy built an entire submarine class around it, and how it keeps vessels like the Ohio class at sea for most of their working lives, longer than almost any other class of warship in the world. Start with what an Ohio-class submarine actually is, because the 2-crew system only makes sense once you understand the job these boats are built for. The Ohio class is the Navy's fleet of nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, commonly shortened to SSBNs. There are 14 of them. Each one exists to do one thing above all else: stay hidden underwater, indefinitely, as a survivable platform for the nation's nuclear deterrent. If a submarine like this can always be somewhere at sea, undetected, then no adversary can ever be certain they've eliminated America's ability to respond to a nuclear attack. That constant, invisible presence is the whole point. Defense analysts call it continuous at-sea deterrence. Per Navy fact sheets, each Ohio-class boat carries Trident 2D5 ballistic missiles and runs on a nuclear reactor that lets it stay submerged for months without refueling or surfacing for air. The machine's physical endurance is, for practical purposes, almost unlimited on a single patrol. The submarine was never the limiting factor. The people inside it always were. That's the core problem the Navy had to solve, going back to the earliest days of the ballistic missile submarine program in the 1960s, with boats like the George Washington class. Send a crew out on patrol, and if that same crew has to sail the boat back, rest, retrain, handle maintenance, and then sail out again, the vessel spends enormous stretches sitting in port waiting on its own sailors to recover. A billion-dollar strategic asset, the tip of the nuclear deterrent spear, would spend much of its life tied to a pier. For a submarine whose entire strategic value depends on being unpredictably somewhere in the ocean, that's close to a contradiction. Here was the obstacle. Nuclear reactors don't need rest. Submarine hulls, within their maintenance cycles, don't need rest. Sailors do. A patrol on an Ohio-class boat commonly runs 70 to 90 days submerged in a sealed metal tube with no sunlight, recycled air, and a crew that can't leave. Human endurance, not mechanical endurance, was the bottleneck. So the Navy stopped trying to make one crew do it all and built 2 instead. That's the blue and gold system. Every Ohio-class SSBN has 2 complete, fully certified crews assigned to it. Not 2 partial teams, but 2 full complements, each with its own commanding officer, its own executive officer, and its own qualified specialists for every watch station on the boat. When the blue crew brings the submarine home from patrol, the gold crew has already spent those same weeks training, studying the boat systems, and preparing. After a turnover period in port, the gold crew takes the submarine back out on the next patrol, while the blue crew stands down, rests, and starts its own training cycle for the rotation after that. I went through a stack of Navy technical and personnel publications on this, and one detail kept jumping out. The crews aren't interchangeable labor. Each one trains and certifies specifically on that exact submarine, down to its equipment quirks and maintenance history, before it's ever allowed to take it to sea. So the ship almost never waits on its people. But that raises an obvious question. If the crews swap out, who's watching the boat between patrols? That's where the part most people never hear about comes in. Between patrols, the submarine goes through what the Navy calls a refit period, typically 3 to 4 weeks, during which it's resupplied, inspected, and has maintenance issues addressed at its home port. The 2 home ports for the Ohio-class SSBN fleet are Naval Base Kitsap in Bangor, Washington for the Pacific boats, and Naval Submarine Base Kings Bay in Georgia for the Atlantic boats. During refit, the outgoing crew hands off responsibility to shore-based maintenance teams and the incoming crew in a formal turnover process, then heads off for months of shore duty, training, and time with family. What's most surprising here isn't the crew swap. It's the ratio it produces. The two-crew rapid refit cycle is specifically built to keep each Ohio-class submarine at sea for most of its operational life, rather than sitting in port, per Navy statements on SSBN operations. Defense reporting has put the at-sea figure for these boats around 60% or more of their time, a remarkably high number for any warship, let alone one the size of the Ohio class. Let's put some numbers on what a single crew actually is, because two crews undersells the scale of what the Navy commits to per hull. An Ohio-class SSBN crew runs around 155 people, roughly 15 officers and about 140 enlisted sailors, covering everything from the reactor plant to sonar to the missile technicians who maintain the Trident systems. Multiply that by 2 crews per submarine across 14 submarines, and the personnel commitment gets enormous. Thousands of sailors trained to a level where the Navy trusts them with the most sensitive weapons system the country owns. That scale creates its own problem. Training an entire second crew to the same standard as the first isn't cheap, and it isn't fast. Nuclear submarine qualification takes years, not weeks, and every watch station on an SSBN, from the reactor control room to the missile compartment, needs sailors certified specifically for that role. Keeping 2 full crews at that standard for every boat indefinitely is a permanent institutional cost, not a temporary fix. The Navy has kept funding it since the ballistic missile submarine force was first stood up, because letting deterrence patrols shrink to fit crew endurance was judged the worst option. What gets me about this case is how much of nuclear deterrence policy comes down to something as unglamorous as workforce scheduling. Ask most people why deterrence has held for decades, and they'll picture missile counts, treaty negotiations, reactor technology. Almost nobody mentions a personnel rotation system built to solve a fatigue problem. But by the Navy's own framing, the blue and gold system is precisely why the deterrent works the way it's designed to. Not because any one submarine is invincible, but because there's almost always one, somewhere, that an adversary can't find. The system solves the endurance problem. But it's not unique to the Ohio class in the way people assume, and that's where it gets more interesting. Worth being precise about which submarines actually use this, because not every U.S. submarine does. The Navy's fast attack submarines, like the Virginia class, typically run with a single crew, since their missions and patrol lengths are different from the SSBN deterrent mission. The 2-crew blue and gold model is specifically tied to the ballistic missile mission. The Ohio-class SSBNs, whose only job is holding nuclear deterrent patrols. 4 other Ohio-class hulls were converted years ago into guided missile submarines, designated SSGNs, carrying conventional Tomahawk missiles instead of nuclear Tridents. The SSBNs, the ones actually carrying the nuclear deterrent, are what this dual crew structure is built around. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. You'd think doubling the crew requirement would make the whole program more vulnerable to funding cuts, not less. In practice, Navy planning and budget documents have generally gone the other way. The program is treated as one of the least negotiable line items in the defense budget, because continuous at-sea deterrence is considered a strategic requirement, not a convenience. Here's a take that'll divide opinion. Given what it costs to train and maintain 2 full nuclear-qualified crews per boat indefinitely, some defense analysts have argued the manpower bill for blue and gold is arguably as strategically important, and as expensive as the submarines themselves, yet it gets a fraction of the public attention a new missile or reactor design gets. Whether that trade-off still holds as the Navy shifts to the newer Columbia-class replacement is a genuinely open debate among defense budget analysts, not a settled question. So here's a real question worth sitting with. Is doubling an entire ship's crew, indefinitely, for every hull in a fleet, a justified cost of nuclear deterrence? Or is it a quietly expensive legacy structure that survives mainly because nobody wants to be the one who changes it? What do you think? There's also a less obvious problem buried in this system: continuity. If a crew hands off a submarine to a completely different set of sailors every few months, how does the Navy keep anything from getting lost in translation? A maintenance issue half fixed? An equipment quirk half understood? The Navy's answer, per its own operational publications, is a formalized turnover process during refit, where outgoing and incoming crews overlap for a defined handoff window, backed by standardized maintenance logs and qualification records that travel with the boat rather than with either crew. The submarine, not the sailors, is treated as the constant. One detail that stuck with me while digging into this: the blue and gold naming itself comes straight from the earliest Polaris missile submarines of the 1960s, and the Navy has kept the same naming convention and largely the same operating logic for more than 60 years across several generations of submarine design. Few systems in the modern military survive that long, largely unchanged, because so few problems stay exactly the same for 60 years. The endurance limits of a human body at sea, it turns out, haven't changed nearly as fast as submarine technology has. That continuity is also exactly what's being tested now, because the Ohio class itself is aging out. Where does this stand today? The Ohio-class SSBN fleet is approaching the end of its planned service life, per Navy statements and public shipbuilding plans, and the Navy is designing and building its replacement, the Columbia-class submarine, which is expected to inherit the same two-crew blue and gold structure for its own ballistic missile patrols. What's confirmed, from the Navy's own public statements, is that the two-crew concept has been formally carried into the Columbia-class program's operating plan. What's less certain, and genuinely a matter of ongoing debate among defense budget analysts, not settled fact, is exactly how shipbuilding delays, maintenance backlogs, and the size of the future submarine qualified workforce will affect how many boats the Navy can keep continuously at sea in the coming decade. Those figures vary across different Government Accountability Office and congressional budget assessments, and this video won't state them as fixed numbers. If you've ever worked a rotating shift where the handoff to the next person mattered more than anything else you did that shift, picture that same handoff. Except the person after you is inheriting a nuclear reactor and a set of ballistic missiles, and a clean handoff is measured in national security terms, not workplace efficiency. We cut a deeper dive into how the actual turnover and refit period works, hour by hour, from this video for length. Comment "refit" if you'd want that as a follow-up. To be clear about the limits of what's verifiable here, patrol lengths, at-sea percentages, and crew sizes for the Ohio-class program are the kind of figures the Navy releases in general ranges rather than exact, real-time numbers for operational security reasons. Legitimately, since the whole strategic value of the program depends on adversaries not being able to predict submarine locations or schedules. Anything stated here as a specific figure reflects publicly released Navy fact sheets or established defense reporting, not classified details, and estimates that vary across sources are described that way rather than presented as one fixed number. So next time you hear that a submarine's been at sea for months, remember it's not one exhausted crew grinding through an entire deployment. It's a system built, deliberately, 60 years ago, and kept largely intact ever since. 2 full crews, 1 submarine, and a permanent overlap in training so the boat itself almost never has to stop. If the Navy's newest submarines are inheriting this same structure, the real story isn't really about one class of submarine at all. It's about how much of nuclear deterrence rests on a scheduling decision most people have never heard of. And if that's the kind of hidden system behind a familiar weapon that interests you, that's exactly the kind of story we keep digging into here.